Okay, so my name is Nate Richmond. My pronouns are he, him, and I work at the IATSE Canadian office. I'm also the chair of the International Pride Committee. Today's session is being made possible by funding from the federal government of Canada through the Canada Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund. And we're proud to have Pride at Work Canada here with us to present Making Meaningful Connections, Effective Communication for 2SLGBTQI+ Inclusion. So without further notice, I'll turn it over to Quinn and we'll get started. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nate. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. So I'm just going to share my screen. So give me one moment to set that up. Perfect. There we go. So I'm here from Pride at Work Canada to share a little bit about making meaningful connections, effective communication for 2SLGBTQIA+ inclusion. And we like to start our sessions off with a land acknowledgement. So Pride at Work Canada operates on the unceded, stolen, and treated traditional territories of hundreds of diverse Indigenous nations, which includes Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ Indigenous communities. If you're unsure of whose lands you're currently working on and living on, please refer to nativeland.ca to learn more. Pride at Work Canada's main office is located in Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. These lands and waters are the traditional homes and territories of and cared for by the Anishinaabe, Wendat, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. And there are over 70 treaties signed between the Government of Canada and diverse Indigenous nations. As a national organization, we support and uphold these treaties. In an act of reconciliation, we also endorse national Indigenous initiatives such as land and water sovereignty and protections and Indigenous human rights issues. We endorse the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples and strive to empower 2SLGBTQIA+ Indigenous peoples residing in what is colonially known as Canada. And for folks who are not familiar with us, I'm going to share as well a little bit about Pride at Work Canada and what we do. So through dialogue, education, and thought leadership, Pride at Work Canada empowers employers to build workplaces that celebrate all employees, regardless of gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation. We help create safer, more inclusive workspaces that realize the full potential of all employees and bring down barriers to employment. Our learning, networking, and community events happen across the country, celebrating and connecting the most inclusive Canadian employers. And so to introduce your facilitators for today. So my name is Quinn Blue. I'll be presenting this session today. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns, il, lui en français. And I'm the Program and Engagement Coordinator with Pride at Work Canada. And I have about 15 years of experience doing 2SLGBTQIA+ focused education, programming, and peer support. And I'm based in the Ottawa area. And I also have my colleague El Martinez supporting today, and they use pronouns they, them. They're the Leadership Programs Coordinator, and they have experience in the nonprofit sector, conducting peer-led education, community outreach, 2SLGBTQIA youth and leadership programming, particularly in Vancouver. And so I'll sort of go through the presentation and there'll be some space for questions, but you can also ask questions throughout in the chat or in the Q&A, and either Eol or myself might jump into the chat and answer some of those things as well. So in terms of today's agenda, basically we'll be going through some effective communication for 2SLGBTQIA+ inclusion, taking action in allyship, questions, and resources. In terms of some guidelines for today, so as Nate mentioned, this session is being recorded. So if you don't want your questions recorded, you can either sort of answer them or ask them in the Q&A, and there's an option in there to ask them anonymously. So we would, read out the question, but we wouldn't know who it's coming from. And there's the option that at the end, we can stop the recording so that there's space for people to ask questions live as well, without it being shared in the recording. So in terms of other aspects of privacy and confidentiality, just understanding that any personal information that's shared during the session should be kept, to yourself. Contribute to cultivating an inclusive and accountable space. So please do ask questions, engage in conversation, and do so with respect, care, and compassion. And if possible, we recognize that, it's challenging to, there's so many opportunities to multitask. It can be really challenging to stay present in a session like this. But we ask that you do your best to stay present while, of course, honoring yourself and your family needs first. And as mentioned, we will have time for Q&A. I will note that only questions related to the subject matter or my professional experience will be answered. So let's get into the session a little bit more. So I'll be going through some different aspects, but I also just want to note that the goal of the session is to have a bit of an introduction to inclusive language, allyship roles, but this isn't going to be sort of a, fully solve all challenges. It's a bit of an introduction, and will hopefully give you some tools that you can use in your workplaces. So feel free to answer in the chat if you'd like. I've used an acronym a few times so far, which is 2SLGBTQIA+. So if you are familiar with what any of those characters in the acronym stand for, feel free to put that in the chat. I'm going to leave about 15 seconds. Okay, I see Two-Spirit. Yeah, so that's the 2S at the beginning there. All right. So, sorry, I almost skipped through too many slides there. So that acronym there, it stands for Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and the plus is an acknowledgement that there are a number of other different identities that aren't explicitly named within that acronym, but that are intended to be included within that acronym. We recognize that it's a bit of a limited acronym in a lot of ways that I know I use because it's a little bit recognizable. People sort of have an idea of what I'm talking about without it trying to include all the identities that we would love to be able to include within it. Oh, okay. I see that people may not be able to chat with everybody. So people can either put any questions or feedback within the Q&A, which people should be able to access, or Nate, if you can adjust the settings on the chat, up to you, whatever works. Perfect, thanks. All right, so a couple of other, so going through the acronym a little bit more. I also want to acknowledge that I've put a lot of different terminology up there. So a slide like this can be a little bit overwhelming. And so what I want to reinforce first is that there's no expectation for people to memorize a bunch of different terminology or to get familiar with every term on this list. This is also a bit of an example list of a few different identities that might fall within our communities, but it's in no way comprehensive. Our communities include so many amazing different identities that are not necessarily all encapsulated within this acronym. And so there's potentially a bit of a shortfall there. Now, the other piece about this is that it includes a lot of different types of identities. So you may see on the screen that there's some different categories that have almost been identified within that acronym, where Two-Spirit is a cultural identity, it's Indigenous specific, and it's a fairly broad umbrella term. And then we have some identities like lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, which are sexual orientations. We have something like trans, which has to do with gender. We have something like intersex there, which has to do with sex assigned at birth. And so really, when we're talking about this acronym, we're not only talking about a number of different identities, but we're talking about a number of different types of identities or aspects of who we are. So all of this to say that there is a wide variety of who we're talking about when we talk about 2SLGBTQIA+ communities. I will suggest one tool that you can use, which is if you're not familiar with a particular term that someone uses for themselves, you can, if the situation is appropriate, ask them, what does that mean to them? If that situation is not appropriate for that, then, we always have a wide variety of resources at our disposal, including looking things up online. I would suggest looking up a few different definitions if you're trying to learn more about someone's identity, because even within our communities, there might be a number of different ways that people describe a word like bisexual. There might be a number of different ways that people might describe that or identify with that word. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another piece, which kind of links to the way that acronym was divided up a little bit, which is these legal grounds. So these are all like protected grounds within human rights codes around sex and gender. So one of these pieces is around sex assigned at birth, which is a label attached to human beings when they're born, based generally upon genitalia or other physical characteristics. And this is one of those pieces of our experience that, for the most part, we don't need to know anything about someone else's sex assigned at birth. It's largely irrelevant in terms of how we would interact with people, how we would treat people. This is something where you would really only need that in terms of maybe someone's legal sex within an HR context, maybe within, a doctor's office type of thing. There might be some aspects of that might be relevant, but those would be really quite limited and should only be used within those specific contexts and should be kept confidential in all other types of contexts. We have these other aspects around gender identity. Those are sort of words that mean the same thing or phrases that mean the same thing. So someone's gender is a person's internal and individual experience of gender, being a man, woman, non-binary, agender, gender fluid, or having a sense of gender that is distinct from those terms. So this is really personal, individual. It's not something that you can see. It's something that you would know if someone shares that about themselves. Now, another aspect of this could be sexual orientation, which is a personal characteristic that encompasses an emotional, romantic, or sexual feelings towards other people. And this is not based on who someone is dating or who someone has dated. It's around those feelings, those emotional, romantic, or sexual feelings. But it's not based on someone's sexual history or current relationship or anything like that. Another piece of this could be gender expression. And gender expression is how one engages with conventions and stereotypes associated with a specific gender to present their gender externally on a daily basis. So this is an idea around masculinity, femininity, androgyny. Could have to do with how someone dresses or mannerisms or hobbies or their haircut or, a number of different things. And so what's important about all of these is that, again, these are all legally protected grounds within our human rights codes. Now, I've sort of talked a little bit about some terms, but there's a couple that I do want to make sure that I'm defining as I've used them a few times already throughout, and I'll be continuing to use them. So some of them are non-binary. So that's an umbrella term for gender identities that fall outside of the man-woman binary. Trans, which means anyone whose gender is something other than what they were expected to be at birth. And cisgender or cis, which is a person whose gender identity is in alignment with the sex they were assigned at birth. And so when we talk again, sort of looking back to those aspects around gender identity, assigned sex, gender expression, this is another way to sort of conceptualize these ideas or explore them a little bit more. So this is the gender galaxy. So you can see there that there's this like sun that is the assigned sex sun that includes male, female, intersex planets. There's this gender identity sun, which includes a number of different planets, including like androgynous, trans, non-binary, cisgender, genderqueer. And then we see these gender expression asteroid belt, I guess, that has, infinite possibilities, as it says. And then there's these other galaxies over there, like the Two-Spirit galaxy and the sexuality galaxy. So this is just sort of another way of conceptualizing our understandings of sex and gender expression. And you can definitely check out this resource that is one that's created by Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. And there will be a link to this, and I can share my slides at the end of the session. And I'm just going to take a sip of water. And so there's a quote here from Julia Serrano that says, remember, it says, we make assumptions every day about other people's gender without ever seeing their birth certificates, their chromosomes, their genitals, their reproductive systems, their childhood socialization, or their legal sex. There's no such thing as a real gender. There's only the gender we experience ourselves as and the gender we perceive others to be. So I think we've all heard a lot about gender, maybe had a lot of specific ideas around what gender is. And we really want to encourage us to consider the broad range of what gender can include as well. Now, I mentioned a little bit already that knowing terminology can be helpful, but it's less about what terminology you know and more about how you speak and act. So it's about your interactions and not our identities. But with that, I will give you a bit of information about a couple of different aspects that can be useful in terms of how we speak to others. So first off, let's talk about pronouns. So we'll talk about some different ways that we talk about pronouns, but to start off with, I want to talk a little bit about gender specific versus gender neutral pronouns. So gender specific pronouns would be the ways that we refer to each other in the third person. People who are transitioning in some way might choose to change their pronouns. People might also use multiple sets of pronouns. There's all sorts of different ways that people might identify with or use different pronouns. So some examples of gender specific pronouns could be she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs, z, here, hers, they, fair, fairs, or others. And then when we're talking about gender neutral pronouns, we're talking about the ways that we refer to each other in the third person when we're unaware of someone's gender specific pronouns, or if the person doesn't use gender specific pronouns. So one example there is they, them, theirs. And you'll notice that that's actually in both of those lists. That's because people might use they, them, theirs as a specific pronoun that they use for themselves. But people might also, we might also use they, them, theirs as a gender neutral pronoun when we're not sure how someone identifies. So when we're not sure what pronouns to use for someone. So I'm going to give you two different examples within that. So when we're talking about gender specific pronouns, I'm going to read out a sentence about Lauren. So in this case, I know Lauren and I know what pronouns she uses. So I saw Lauren come to work today. She seemed really happy. I wonder if it has anything to do with her weekend. I hope I see her soon to hear all about it. Now, what if I'm in a situation where I actually don't know what pronouns Lauren uses? I haven't had the opportunity to ask, and they haven't shared them with me yet. So I saw Lauren come to work today. They seemed really happy. I wonder if it has anything to do with their weekend. I hope I see them soon to hear all about it. So we see where I might use gender neutral pronouns, or I could also just use Lauren's name if I know Lauren's name, but not pronouns. And so those would be what we use if we're not familiar with what pronouns someone uses. Once we know someone's pronouns, we should use the correct pronouns for them. So it's totally fine to, use gender neutral pronouns if you're not sure. And that's, we never want to assume what pronouns someone uses. So it's great to use neutral ones or the person's name until we know otherwise. But once we do know, it's important to use the correct ones. And these things are really meaningful and important to people. And I see a question in the chat around sie, here, hers, and fe, fair, fairs pronouns. So these would be pronouns that are considered sometimes called neopronouns. So there are pronouns that have sort of been created within community. And they are pronouns that are, like non-binary pronouns. And you can kind of see like you would use them in the same way that you use other. So I saw Lauren come to work today and Z seemed really happy. I wonder if it has anything to do with your weekend. I hope I see her soon to hear all about it. So, you can kind of, the structure mirrors the gendered pronouns that we use within language as well. And to sort of bring in a little bit more, how to interact with people around pronouns. First off, it's important to ask. So you can't tell someone's name or pronouns just by looking at them. So if you're unsure of someone's pronouns, be attentive to how others refer to this person. And if you're still unclear or concerned that people might be using the incorrect pronoun, politely and privately ask that person what pronoun that they use. And there's also some other ways that you can kind of create space for pronouns that I'll mention on the next slide. Another important piece is respect. If someone takes the time to let you know their name and pronoun, use it, respect it, and it's not up to you to decide someone else's identity. And practice. So if you have difficulty using someone's pronouns and name, practice. Ask coworkers, peers, and friends to point out when you've made a mistake. And one thing that I like to do is just practice in my head even. So run through those sentences and stories and just repeat the correct pronouns in my head. So like, let's say that Lauren uses Z here pronouns, okay, so I saw Lauren coming to work today. Z seemed happy. I wonder how your dog is doing. Your dog seems very cool, right? So I'm going to practice those in my head as well. And I mentioned that there's other ways as well to create space for pronouns. So if you want to make sure that there's an opportunity for people to share where you don't necessarily have to ask people specifically, you can do things like have name tags and nameplates to show, to have a spot for someone's pronouns. So there's an example there where it's, hello, my name is Quinn. My gender pronouns are he, him, they, them. You can start meetings by having everybody introduce themselves and stating their pronouns. And that one of the pieces around that is making sure that you're not just asking people who you think might be non-binary or trans or anything like that, but you're asking everybody to do this. So it's not singling anyone out. It's important to, create space for pronouns by modeling it within yourself as well. So think about adding pronouns to your LinkedIn profile or email signatures or your display on your Zoom or anything like that. So there's lots of ways that you can share your own pronouns and use that as an opportunity for other people to share them back with you. I think it's also really useful to avoid the use of gendered titles. So not using gender specific titles like Mr., Mix, Miss, Ms., Mrs. You would only use those if you already know that those are the correct titles to use for someone. Otherwise, you can just use the person's name, like first and last name or their name, whatever is appropriate within your specific field. It's not required to use gender terms like ma'am or sir or miss, ladies, guys, when greeting someone or when referring to a group. And those are things that should generally be avoided. And you can always, again, go back to ask, request information that you need to help people feel respected. And we have some examples of phrases that you might use while avoiding gendered titles. Things like, hi there, how are you today? How can I help you today? Is there anything you need me to know to help us better meet your needs? What would you like support with? What's your name? What pronouns do you use? And again, like I find it really helpful when I'm introducing myself. I might say, hi, my name's Quinn. I use he, they pronouns. What's your name and pronouns? And again, that creates that space for sharing back. And this can feel really intimidating, and we might sometimes feel afraid of making mistakes, which might even make us afraid to, do anything at all, like interact with someone who's trans or ask questions or anything like that. And what I want to reassure you is that everybody makes mistakes. And so when you make one, find a balance between owning your error and fixing the situation. So mistakes, they happen. And the important piece is that we acknowledge the mistake, that we apologize, and that we commit to doing better. And one thing that's really important is to consider in the moment if you're prioritizing the person who has been harmed when you're apologizing. So a bit of an example of something not to do is if you've made a mistake about someone's pronouns, you don't necessarily want to make a really big deal out of it, or make it about you and your guilt about making a mistake. So, you don't want to cause more of a fuss. Oh no, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I'm not a bad person. I think like leave that behind as much as possible. But instead focus in on, oh, thanks for letting me know. Sorry about that. And continue what you were doing. Oh yes, so Lauren said that Z did these things. So apologize, correct yourself, use the correct pronouns if possible, and commit to doing better. So this is where that practice comes in. This is where that getting people to correct you comes in, and making an effort to do better in the future. Okay, so some of what we've been talking about is largely around gender, pronouns, things like that. So I want to kind of go back a bit and talk about sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is a personal characteristic that encompasses an emotional, romantic, or sexual feelings towards other people. And it's the attraction felt for others, not the sexual behavior or sexual history, that defines one's orientation. So again, just a reminder that you can't make assumptions about a person's orientation based on their current partner, their previous relationships, or sexual activity. And to kind of, again, here's another model that people can use to help understand this a little bit, which is the sexuality galaxy, where we have to one side the sexual orientation sun, which includes things like pansexual, gay, heterosexual, demisexual, monosexual, questioning. And we also have the romantic orientation sun over there that has planets like queer platonic, polyamorous, aromantic. And so just sort of understanding that there's all sorts of different ways that people might have their own planets or comets or moons or anything like that, and ways that they interact with these galaxies. So I've got a few tools here around respectful conversation. We've spoken about some of these a little bit already, but I've got a few sort of tips. So first off is to start with yourself. So explain who you are before asking details of another person. So I gave an example of this already of, my name is Quinn. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them. What about you? So leading with yourself. Now, another thing that's really useful is to have a reason. So ensure that you have a solid reason for requesting information before you decide to request that information, because maybe you don't need it, and try to figure out the reason will help you figure that out as well. But if you do have a reason, you can share that as well. So for example, we add pronouns to our client profiles, which should be used when contacting you. So you're sharing, this is what we're going to do with that information. This is why we're asking it. Another useful tip is to mirror language. So what we mean by that is to use the same words that someone uses for themselves. So if someone uses a term to describe their identity or relationship, use those words. So, someone might say, my wife and I had a fun trip. How did you and your partner enjoy your vacation? So for that person who's saying, my wife and I would ask them about how their wife is doing. But for that person who's talking about their partner, I would ask them about how their partner is doing. So mirror language, use the words that people use for themselves. And don't assume. So it can be harmful to make assumptions based on limited information. And so, we don't know a lot of these things about people unless they share it with us. And so we can act and interact in ways that don't place specific assumptions on people in any of these areas. So not assuming that someone's trans or cis or non-binary or anything like that, not assuming someone's gender by looking at them, not assuming someone's sexual orientation, assuming that we just can't know. And so we can ask people questions in neutral ways or share information in neutral ways, but not assuming that someone, for instance, one could say like, and it sort of depends on like whether a question makes sense in a workplace or not. But it's the difference between asking someone, oh, do you have a partner? Are you seeing anyone? Which, depending on context, may not be appropriate in your workplace, probably, versus asking someone who you presume is a man, oh, do you have a girlfriend? Do you have a wife? So that's the difference there of asking in a neutral way versus asking in a way that presumes that they're straight. That being said, just because you want to know something doesn't mean you have the right to ask about it. So we may not need to know things about people's identities. And not everybody is there to share that information about themselves or educate about those identities or anything like that. So again, before you ask, think. So before you ask about someone's transition, think about whether or not it's appropriate to discuss one's personal medical history. And it's usually not, so don't ask those things. Before you ask about someone's sexual practices, think about whether it would be acceptable to ask a straight cis colleague these questions, and it wouldn't be. So again, don't ask. And again, before you think about asking someone's medical sex, think about whether you're a healthcare provider or researcher dealing with the person in a clinical setting. And I suspect that you are not, so don't ask. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit of like, what are some actions that you can take to be supportive to 2SLGBTQIA plus colleagues? But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A or into the chat. And I'm happy to continue to answer any questions that come in. So you can also share, if you'd like, what are some of the roles and responsibilities of allyship with trans and gender diverse individuals and communities? So some of the things that we like to think about, and you can you can add things in the chat and I'll read them out as well. But some of the things that we like to think about are self-education. So being at this webinar is a great piece of that, or this session is a great piece of that. We also have, a variety of webinars, resources, leadership programs, and there's a number of different ways that you can continue your own education. whether that's in listening to podcasts, reading novels that include depictions of trans and non-binary or 2SLGBTQIA plus people, attending community events or your employee resource group events. There's a number of different ways to continue your own education. There's also things that you can do within your workplace setting around intervening in certain situations. So part of that can be willing to challenge your own assumptions, challenge other people's assumptions, to learn from mistakes. So if you do make those mistakes, that's perfectly fine. It's just important to learn from them and work on doing better in the future. You can also do, if you are in a context where it feels okay for you to do so, you can address comments that other people make. You can try your best to model inclusive language. So whether that's in having your own pronouns shared in your email signature, or when you introduce yourself, you're sort of making that more common within your workspace, you're normalizing it. And that can be really important for people. If you have colleagues who are part of these communities, you can reach out and ask how you can support. And that, particularly if you have like an employee resource group or anything like that, there may be things that you can do to support the work of your ERG or Pride group. If you have a colleague who's facing workplace discrimination, you can offer to accompany them when they go to HR, and they may not want this, right? Like this might not be a good fit, but that's something that if you feel like you can do and they feel like it would be useful, that's something that you can offer. And sort of, advocate for accountability, advocate for change. A couple of other pieces that you can do are supporting community. So if you've got some spare money to give to local mutual aid funds or community groups or charities, that's always a way to support. You can, support your local 2SLGBTQIA plus owned businesses and services, engage in local, provincial, national, and or global advocacy for 2SLGBTQIA plus rights. You can provide mentorship opportunities for 2SLGBTQIA plus students, employees, and job seekers. And mentorship and sponsorship doesn't always have to be super formalized either. It can also be around those informal relationships that you form within your workplaces. It can be about, talking up your 2SLGBTQIA plus colleagues and recommending them for jobs, supporting people in getting a leg up in your industry in whatever ways are possible. Supporting your ERGs and getting involved in groups and Pride. And there's a couple of different organizations on this slide deck there. They're a bit of a combination of local to Ottawa, where I'm based, local to Toronto, where our main office is based, and Justice Trans, which is sort of a broader Canada-wide organization that does work around legal aspects. And so there's sort of a couple of different organizations that I wanted to shout out on this slide. And one more second to take a sip of water. Sort of continuing on with some of the things that you can do within your own workspaces are that you can advocate for change. So Some of the things that we like to see in a workplace are 2SLGBTQIA plus inclusive policies, and sort of the ways that they play out concretely within your workplace as well. Having all gender washrooms and change rooms available. I know that that's something that gets talked about a lot, but it does matter to people to be able to use the washroom. If there's no access to washrooms, it's not a very positive workspace. We also like to see things like inclusive benefits, eliminating gender-related dress code restrictions. So dress codes should be based on things like health and safety requirements. So if people have to wear, steel-toed boots, that's a very valid dress code restriction. If people have to wear a specific, branded uniform, okay, that's fine too. But what we want to avoid is having a separate dress code for women and men, for instance. But rather that there is a set of, dress code guidelines that apply to people regardless of gender, and that are based specifically in those, safety requirements, or if there's specific sort of branding requirements or things like that. So those might be factors to consider. We also like to see an increase in representation in leadership and governance. When 2SLGBTQIA plus people are in leadership roles, the workplaces tend to be more supportive of folks within our communities all the way down. And there's some pretty easy things that people can do as well. Again, putting your pronouns in your email signatures, business cards, anything like that. And consider having a positive space campaign. And remember, it's not the duty of 2SLGBTQIA plus individuals to educate you. There is a lot of great information out there. So there are some exceptions to that, of course, where, I'm here as my job to do education. This is something that I'm really interested in doing. But your colleague who's just doing their job, which doesn't have anything to do with 2SLGBTQIA plus education, might not necessarily be there to educate you. So, approach the resources that are there. Feel free to ask me any questions as well, but not necessarily asking your colleague at lunch, right? Okay, so that was quite a bit of different information. I don't see any questions in the chat or Q&A right now, but you're welcome to continue to share any. And I'll just note that I've got a whole lot of different resources within that slide deck as well that I'm happy to share out with all of you. There's immediate support resources, some resources for learning more, and my contact information for questions and follow-up, except that my contact information is incorrect there. I will fix that. All right. So yeah, are there any questions in the chat or Q&A that folks would like to have answered? I'll stop sharing for now.
Maybe if there are no questions at this part, maybe we will turn off the recording in case anyone wants to ask questions at that point. Would that be okay with you, Quinn, if we ended the official part there?
Yeah, great. For sure. And I do see one question in the Q&A that is around making frequent pronoun mistakes due to ADHD. So is it appropriate to disclose this when apologizing, or is it an excuse? Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that um, for the most part, we also do see that like there's a bit of a different feeling between someone making a mistake accidentally and someone making a mistake like repeatedly maliciously. Um, and so I know like I tend to have a lot of grace for people who are, maybe making a mistake um, just accidentally. I would say doing your best to practice and trying to like adjust how you think about people and trying to challenge some of your assumptions about gender because I think sometimes that can be what comes into play. I think in terms of disclosing, that's a really personal choice that's sort of up to you. If you are disclosing ADHD or neurodivergence around sort of some of the why you make mistakes around pronouns, I would just be conscious of how you're framing it. So not saying it in a way where you're saying like, so I couldn't possibly get it right and I don't need to try, but saying it in a like, where you're saying, I know this is important and here are the things that I'm going to do to try to get it right. I am going to practice. Please continue to like correct me. I'm going to ask a colleague to help me out to practice and make it, so that I make fewer mistakes. And here's a piece that makes that complicated for me. Right. So I think it's up to you whether you choose to disclose something like that, but being careful around how you phrase it to not make it an excuse, but something that you're sharing around why it makes it a little bit complicated, but that you're going to continue to do better and then continue to try to do better. It's hard, but we can all work on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's you have a lot of grace around people who are trying. It's just that you have to show you are trying, and trying to wrap your head around things that maybe you're not so aware of, or were part of your normal way of speaking prior to taking webinars like this. So I will thank you both for coming today. I will thank Pride at Work. This is amazing. This is great info. The best webinars and presentations have specific things that we can do, and that's exactly what you've told us, which is awesome. And I think it will help us all communicate more effectively and more respectfully with each other in our workplaces and outside of our workplaces. So thank you so much for being with us today. I really, really appreciate that.
Thanks so much, Nate.
Thank you so much for having us.